is Diane Cole. I am a middle school English language arts instructional coach with JCPS, and I'm here this morning to talk about using Hyperdocs to support student learning. So we'll start off by asking the question, what is a Hyperdoc? Because there is it's kind of a nebulous term. However, it was coined by Lisa Highfield, Kelly Hilton, and Sarah Landis, who are all teachers. And it comes in this tradition of hypertext and hypermedia that has actually been with us since the 60s. So we'll kind of look. This is a basic Hyperdoc. It's an elementary example. You'll notice it starts with an engage and explore and explain. There's an elaborate and evaluate. So that is what a Hyperdoc looks like. And when we're talking about hypertext, we're talking about articles. A lot of times it's most of the things that you see on the web, because HTML stands for Hypertext Markup Language, correct? So here is an article from EdWeek, and you'll notice that it has links within it. And that is part of what makes it hypertext. Hypermedia was coined about the same time as hypertext by the same gentleman, Theodore Holm Nelson. And he is one of our computer pioneers. The hypermedia just means that there's other media connected to it. But since we've expanded our definition of text to include so many other things now, hypertext is probably just as synonymous. So Hyperdoc was trademarked by Highfield, Hilton, and Landis. So it is a trademark term. So if you use capital H Hyperdoc, or if you want to call it a hyper lesson, it really doesn't matter what you call it. What has mattered is if you can use this form to deliver great instruction to your kids. So if you think of their definitions of Hyperdoc as being transformative, interactive Google Doc created by teachers, you're trying to educate with something and you're putting it in a nice, tight little package. They make a distinction between a Hyperdoc and a multimedia text set. We'll talk about that a little bit later. So let's look at the basics of the Hyperdoc form. Here's some good examples. The first thing that you'll notice about Hyperdocs is boxes. It's all about boxes. So the box usually guide the students to do something. This is the link example that I made of a multimedia text set to learn about Hyperdocs that you all will have access to. So there are examples, and I have changed the background fill on the boxes so that you know which type of resource is available in each box. For example, these purple boxes are kind of exemplars of the form, and these yellow ones are more about how to learn about more about Hyperdocs and some professional resources. So that's the first thing we notice. It's all about boxes. A basic Hyperdoc always guides students through a learning process. As I said, Highfield et al. Really push the explain, explore, apply, and guidance through steps. This is a lovely example from Health and PE, taking us through the cardiovascular system. If you notice, here's the step, and it goes through what it is, some labeling, and then all the way to assessment. We also try with Hyperdocs to really engage students. So one way is through visuals. If you'll notice, there's not a ton of text on the doc itself. So it's not text heavy and dense. It's made for the students to click through and engage with the resources. Sometimes people find it less daunting to have big blocks of text. So this one is a very interesting one, ELA example about perception versus reality and getting them to explore that question. Now, interestingly enough, the creators would call this and what I've created for you for professional learning, they would call these multimedia text sets instead of Hyperdocs. I think it really matters what terminology you use. I think it matters more that you are taking students through a process. So in professional learning, you'll notice a lot of times we don't have any products the way that we do with students. So perhaps that's why they turn into multimedia text sets. But if you'll notice here, there is a Google form to share what you've learned, but there isn't the true stepping through part 1, part 2, part 3, part 4 of a lesson with a synthesis and reflection. You'll also notice with great hyper lessons or hyperdocs that students always have to do something with the knowledge. Here's another lovely example for music. And thank you to my colleagues, Mr. Robinson, for sharing this with me. This is on instruments of the orchestra. And if you'll notice at each point, there's something for the students to do, which serves as formative assessment along the way. I also love the drag and drop feature on this. So you'll notice we're back to boxes, but we also have other media pulled in for the students to be able to do this formative assessment. So there were the basics of Hyperdocs. How to go to the next level with crafting is to consider your backwards planning process. Consider purpose, process, and product. And thanks to the Deeper Learning team for providing this, which is also available in your resources. Here is their 4P document that helps you through the planning process, your products, your process, and your purpose. And if all of these parts are present in a good Hyperdoc, you're going to provide a substantial lesson for students. You should also use your content curriculum frameworks to begin designing. I know within the ELA frameworks, you can look, and we already have provided interesting, compelling questions that would be a great place to start designing, as well as the standards. If you're going back and using that 4P planning document and you consider this question, how do we fight the unfair? That would be a really lovely question for the moment. And those standards, you can go back and use that in that 4P document. There are also lots of hyperlinked resources already available in the curriculum frameworks to help you get started. As you're crafting, you should also consider how you're affirming racial equity. Now, again, I believe the coiners of the term would call this a multimedia text set, but these questions from DEP are crucial and key right now as we're designing things for our students. And we should be thinking about the different descriptors, are using examples from a variety of cultures and groups as you're picking things to put as links in these Hyperdocs. And considering these questions will help you start from a really strong base, knowing that you're trying to reach all your students. You should also consider how you use color, font, and different basic principles of design. I've linked a cute little video here that you're welcome to use. I'm not going to play it right now on the channel, but there are basic principles of design such as color and repetition and contrast and size that will help to guide your students' eyes and help to engage them and make this worth something aesthetically to your students as well. And you should also really consider how students will show what they know, what kind of products you're using. We'll talk about a little bit later a term called dog fooding when we talk about those products. Looking at this kind of next level past the basics, you can see this really great example from math on angle relationships. It takes students through an engaged process. And if you'll notice here, we're looking at things that students have seen before and can consider in real world examples, which I think is wonderful. I also wanted to note that our math leads said you should, if you're a math person, you should look in the IM groups that you're a part of already, because some of these have been created for you and vetted against the standards, which makes for a much easier start of things. And again, you'll notice that cycle, that explain, the explore, apply. So that really hones in on there being a purpose, a process, and a product. And that purpose is stated right up at the top with the objectives. I think it's a very clear example. Here's an example from English that tries to take in some of the lessons of affirming racial equity. So we are looking at poems from a variety of sources and groups, and not just things from the past, but things from the contemporary. There is support in each and every resource where you have an audio as well as a text. It also allows students to personalize, so they can take one pathway going through the blue boxes first, or they can take another pathway going through the white boxes first. And those are just a couple of the ideas from our colleagues at DEP, but there are so many more that can be included to make a really solid lesson. Here's another example from English that I love. This isn't called a Hyperdoc. This is called a playlist, which is another way of looking at this type of document. She has gone all the way through an entire unit of study to create an argument, and each of the steps is entered right here. Now, she hasn't done a lot with color and contrast and all of those things, but it makes it no less a very engaging lesson. And I really wanted to call out a couple of things. One, she's given different ways to choose a student's topic, but where she has gathering evidence, I love how many options she has given on ways to collect evidence. This is a lovely way of differentiating in the process part and the formative assessment part. So the students are thinking themselves about which way would be most effective for them to take notes, and it allows you to see student thinking. When we get to this next level with Hyperdocs, we're not just usually getting one product or one pat answer in the formative assessment along the way. We are getting at student thinking, and we're also learning which choices they make. And we shouldn't be seeing the same exact answer over and over again, but a depth and variety of answers. So thinking on to making Hyperdocs the best that they can possibly be, we can look at student choice being available in the process and the product. So if you think about choice in the process, we can look back to the interdisciplinary choice boards, which my colleagues Ryan and Suzanne did 2 weeks ago. If you think about these different choices, how does the current pandemic compare to the 1918 pandemic, for example? That is one of the choices to get to the end task. So there is a differentiation in the process along the way, and students can choose where they're going to start, which can make a difference. This choose your own adventure. I might not be ready to do this mental lift today, but I might be just fine with doing this much. I think that type of choice within the process could be really valuable during NTI. We can also think about choice in the product. So this is from our colleagues at Deeper Learning, Maddie and Joe. This is their movies are lit process, which when you're thinking about a Hyperdoc or a hyper lesson, The wonderful thing about these is something like this. You can push out a copy to each of your students, and they're working right within the copy itself in your Google Classroom, instead of there being 15 different posts that students and parents are getting. There's one, which can be much less overwhelming in the long run. I've seen things where parents are overwhelmed by all of the notifications that they're receiving. So if they just receive one for this project that's really well laid out, and every piece of it is there for the student to answer within the Hyperdoc or Hyper lesson, I think that can provide a level of streamlining that we really need at this point.
Hey, Diane, I completely agree. And I think that's a great idea, that for our viewers, that first of all, the Hyperdocs are great. But then also, like you said, when they post one Google slide and they add to it that way, it makes it easier for the students and the parents. And I did want to, we have in the chat, people asked if this will be, if this presentation will be recorded and up, and yet the answer to that is yes, it will be. And also Diane, your presentation is linked on the virtual schedule as well. So I just wanted to make sure the viewers heard that, because we had a couple questions about this, and everyone's loving this information. So.
Okay, wonderful. And all of the links, I double checked and made sure they're available to anyone who has the link. So if we have some of our colleagues in other areas, they should be able to get to everything. So I also wanted to call out that in a really great Hyperdoc or Hyper lesson, there are going to be ways for students to engage with the teacher. This is one that I have been playing with and working on about poetry, because I know it's National Poetry Month and there are teachers who are wanting to do things with poetry, and I wanted to have an exemplar out there. I also wanted to play with using our instructional framework to create a Hyperdoc, and that the framework itself, like these boxes, are available in the resources for English teachers if you want to try this idea out on your own. So as I went through this, I thought about, okay, we have a way for the student to respond and me to check on it as a teacher, and that's one way of communicating. But I also wanted to think about using Google Meet, and at what point within the student work I would want to meet with them, and thinking about including this within the Hyperdoc or the Hyper lesson. This is our Google Meet. This is what we'll be discussing. I would include my time and my date, but that way they know this is the point up to in the learning where we'll be discussing, and creating multiple points of those. I am really excited to hear more about Jamboard, because I think that might be another way to get class discussion going asynchronously.
Yes, you're exactly right. That is a great plug in there. And then just to say, Elaine will be doing that on Friday at 10:30. So that'll be awesome for this
Perfect. Too. And if you look at this, everything is available on the slide. The way the students answer is available on the slide. The resources are available on the slide. Something that I really thought about with must do and may do, or changing the background for your boxes so that you're giving students a little advice even through the coloring. You just go over here and you can change the color of a box. And if you say you must do all of the yellow boxes and you may do any of the blue boxes that you would like, that's another way to kind of differentiate. Another thing that's wonderful is right in here, if I had extra supports to offer, if I wanted to differentiate this and assign the ones with extra supports to certain students, that would be a possibility. And I can also go back and change this. So once I've made it, it's something that I can reuse again and again.
Hey, Diane, I had a thought too when you were talking about the different instructions. What I've seen some teachers do is they will put like the may do or the can do over to the side, like where that white space was. Like you can put actual, text boxes there as well and give instructions over on the left and the right. Not on the actual slide, but over to the left and the right. So the kids have more room on the actual slide.
That is a great idea. And I was also thinking about comments being able to be put to the side. So I think this is a really great way to design instruction right now. Different Hyperdocs for different students is a possibility, as is adding in levels of supports and collaborating with other teachers to create these. It'd be great for a PLC to come together and create one of these hyper lessons, Hyperdocs, to give to the entire sixth grade, say with the PLC. Another thing with really great Hyperdocs is you're going to give students multiple opportunities to revise, and you can be flexible with times and dates. So as you're starting this journey, here are a few things to consider. Consider your curriculum frameworks as a great starting point and a way to vet resources, or a way to start with resources. Like I said, there's already a lot of things hyperlinked into those frameworks. There's also some wonderful, wonderful resources on the NTI website. We've got things that are already web-based so that you can begin crafting and creating. The Deeper Learning Planning Tool offers the essentials for mapping out the learning journey. If you consider each part of that planning tool, you should have a really solid lesson. Don't forget to provide criteria for success and exemplars, and consider dog fooding. So I'm going to kind of jump down here. I love Cult of Pedagogy. She did an article recently. Well, actually, it's been a long time ago, but it came back up recently about the term dog fooding, which is evidently used among software developers. It's not something that I've heard of in education, but we've advocated for years that if you have an assignment, you should do it yourself. And among software developers, it's called eating your own dog food. So if you're doing a Hyperdoc or any lesson really, and you do what you're asking the students to do themselves and see what a lift it is and how hard it is, and also consider that you are an expert and you're having students come to you as novices in these subjects. Even if we're going over things that we've learned earlier in the year, you still have a lot of education behind you. So think about what you're doing and how much time it takes you to do, and kind of multiply that a little bit for your students. I also want you to consider, if you're looking for Hyperdocs on the web, and there are a lot of things out there, be sure to vet them for alignment to your standards and importance to your discipline. So, I wouldn't give a 3-week lesson right now on figurative language as a language arts teacher. It's important to the discipline, but I don't know if my students would be able to be sustained in something like that for 3 weeks at this point. So think about your students' needs and your alignment to standards and your importance to your discipline and what they can be engaged with. And also be sure to check for student friendliness. Again, if you find something out on the internet, make sure that you do all the pieces yourself and check all the links and make sure everything is friendly and age appropriate.
I'm so glad you said that, Diane. That is so important all the time, but especially right now. We have to make sure that, we are checking those links and making sure they work, because that's just going to cause more work for you in the back end. If you receive, 30, 40, 60 emails, this link doesn't work.
Well, correct. And things change dynamically from day to day.
Yes.
So again, I started off with the coiners of this term. And right now, I don't know if I can get to it, but they have already changed their domain so that you have to log in now. So I couldn't, this link was broken in the time that it took me to make this presentation.
Exactly. Technology changes every second, right?
Yes, it changes. So just make sure that you're looking at things. And again, there are lots of resources out there. You're welcome to contact me and contact all of our folks at CDLI. Any of our leads or coaches are more than willing to help you out as you design things moving forward and be a person to bounce things off of. So we appreciate your time.
Thank you so much. And we appreciate your time and all of the valuable information that you and your colleagues at CDLI